Consequentialism, MPCR 5000, written and presented by Professor Scott T. Applegate, Georgetown University. Tonight, we will begin our exploration of consequentialism, one of the foundational ethical frameworks in philosophy and its application to cybersecurity ethics. We will look at three of the men who originated consequentialist theories, discuss different consequentialist frameworks, and explore some of the arguments for and against consequentialism. Can anyone identify the structure in the cover slide? And if so, can you guess why I included it here? The panopticon is a type of institutional building and a system of control designed by English philosopher and social theorist Jeremy Bentham, one of the founders of utilitarian ethics, which we'll be discussing later today. The concept of the design is to allow all prisoners of an institution to be observed by a single security guard without the inmates being able to tell whether they are being watched. Although it is physically impossible for the single guard to observe all inmate cells at once, the fact that the inmates cannot know when they are being watched means that they are motivated to act as though they were always being watched. Thus, the inmates are effectively compelled to regulate their own behavior based on the possibility of surveillance. Let me start with this powerful quote from Jeremy Bentham. It is the greatest good to the greatest number of people which is the measure of right and wrong. This simple statement encapsulates the core principle of consequentialist thinking, that the morality of our actions should be judged by their outcomes and their impact on the greatest number of people. Keep this principle in mind as we move through today's presentation. Now, for those of you who are Star Trek fans, you might recognize this consequentialist thinking in action. Spock's famous line, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the one," is pure utilitarian philosophy. Apparently, Spock was a utilitarian. This shows how consequentialist thinking has permeated our popular culture and reflects an ethical framework that many of us are intuitively familiar with, even if we haven't formally studied it. So, what exactly is consequentialism? At its core, consequentialism encompasses ethical theories that judge the morality of an action solely by its consequences. You may also hear consequentialism referred to as teleological ethics, from the Greek telos meaning end and logos meaning science, essentially the study of ends or outcomes. It is also commonly called utilitarian ethics, a term many of you may be more familiar with. The key point here is that under consequentialism, an action that produces good outcomes is moral, regardless of the nature of the action itself. In other words, the ends justify the means. Consequentialist ethics originated in the utilitarian theories of Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sedgwick. Jeremy Bentham was born in Houndsditch, London in 1748 to a wealthy family. He was a child prodigy, beginning to learn Latin at the age of 3 and to play violin by the age of 7. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from Queen's College, Oxford, and trained as a lawyer, although he never practiced. He was a renowned jurist, social reformer, and political radical whose writings and theories had considerable influence on the reform of prisons, schools, courts, laws, and parliament. What's particularly interesting about Bentham is that he was ahead of his time on many social issues. He was an early proponent of individual and economic freedoms, separation of church and state, freedom of expression, equal rights for women, the right to divorce, animal rights, greater availability of education, abolition of slavery, and the abolition of the death penalty. Many of the progressive values we take for granted today were championed by Bentham over 200 years ago, and they all stemmed from his utilitarian framework. What actions would produce the greatest good for the greatest number? Here's another beautiful quote from Bentham that shows a different side of his philosophy. Stretching his hands up to reach the stars, too often man forgets the flowers at his feet. This reminds us that while utilitarian ethics focuses on maximizing good consequences, it also calls us to pay attention to simple, immediate goods in life, not just grand, distant goals. It's a reminder about balance and perspective in ethical thinking. John Stuart Mill was born in 1805 in Pentonville, Middlesex, England, as the eldest son of the Scottish philosopher, historian, and economist James Mill and his wife Harriet Barrow. Mill was educated by his father with the advice and assistance of Jeremy Bentham and Francis Place. He was given an extremely rigorous upbringing and was deliberately shielded from association with children his own age other than his siblings. At the age of 3, he was taught Greek. By the age of 8, he had read many of the Greek classics, such as Aesop's Fables and the whole of Herodotus, and was acquainted with Lucian, Diogenes, Laertius, Socrates, and the 6 dialogues of Plato. He had also read a great deal of history and English and had been taught math, physics, and astronomy. Mill is renowned for his writings in logic, epistemology, economics, social and political philosophy, ethics, metaphysics, religion, and current affairs, and is considered the most influential English-speaking philosopher in the 19th century. What is epistemology? It is the theory of knowledge, especially with regard to methods, validity, and scope. Epistemology is the investigation of what distinguishes justified belief from opinion. So you might say epistemology is one of the focuses of this course. Mills believed the best methods of explaining the world are those employed by the natural sciences and railed against intuitionist doctrine. The intuitionist doctrine conceives of nature as being largely or wholly constituted by the mind, rather than more or less imperfectly observed by it. One of the great dangers presented by this doctrine from Mill's perspective is that it supports the belief that one can know universal truths about the world through evidence provided by the mind alone, including intuitions or Kantian categories of understanding, rather than by nature. If the mind constitutes the world we experience, then we can understand the world by understanding the mind. It was this freedom from appeal to nature and the lack of independent checks, i.e. empirical evidence, to the knowledge claims associated with it that Mills found so disturbing. Mill was a proponent of freedom of speech, individual liberty, abolition, and women's rights. At the same time, Mills was also a proponent of British colonialism and argued in support of what he called benevolent despotism with regard to the colonies. To suppose that the same international customs and the same rules of international morality can obtain between one civilized nation and another, and between civilized nations and barbarians, is a grave error. To characterize any conduct whatsoever towards a barbarous people as a violation of the law of nations only shows that he who speaks so has never considered the subject. So Mills was also a man of his times. Mill famously wrote, "Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure and the absence of pain." This quote clarifies what Mill meant by good consequences. He defined them in terms of happiness, which he further described as pleasure and the absence of pain. This is the foundation for hedonic utilitarianism, which we'll discuss in more detail shortly. Henry Sedgwick was born in Skipton, Yorkshire, England, where his father, the Reverend W. Sedgwick, was headmaster of the local grammar school. He was an economist and a famous teacher. Sedgwick was the Knightsbridge Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Cambridge from 1883 until his death in 1900, and is best known in philosophy for his utilitarian treatise, The Methods of Ethics. He was one of the founders and first president of the Society for Psychical Research, a member of the Metaphysical Society, and he promoted the higher education of women. In 1875, he co-founded Newnham College, a women-only constituent college of the University of Cambridge. It was the second Cambridge college to admit women. Sedgwick adopted a position that may be described as ethical hedonism, according to which the criteria of goodness in any given action is that it produces the greatest amount of personal pleasure. Sedgwick was brought up in the Church of England, but drifted away from Orthodox Christianity, and as early as 1862, he described himself as a theist, independent from established religion. For the rest of his life, although he regarded Christianity as indispensable and irreplaceable, looking at it from a sociological point of view, he found himself unable to return to it as a religion. Sedgwick died as an avowed agnostic. Sedgwick focused on the principles of conduct and common sense morality and tried to systematize utilitarian ethics into a rigorous philosophical system. He authored The Method of Ethics, which has been described as the best treatise on moral theory ever written. The Method of Ethics is an exemplar for how ethics should be researched as an academic subject. Sedgwick wrote, "Reason shows me that if my happiness is desirable and good, the equal happiness of any other person must be equally desirable." This is a crucial principle of utilitarian ethics, the idea that everyone's happiness counts equally. Your happiness isn't more important than mine, and mine isn't more important than a stranger's halfway around the world. This impartial perspective is both one of the utilitarian's greatest strengths and one of its most demanding features. So, we have this classic definition of consequentialism. An act is morally right if and only if that act maximizes the good. That is, if and only if the total amount of good for all minus the total amount of bad for all is greater than the net amount for any incompatible act available to the agent on that occasion. That's quite a mouthful, and it raises several critical questions. What defines right? What is good? Good for who? Does context matter? These questions have generated centuries of philosophical debate, and different consequentialist thinkers have given different answers. Additionally, utilitarianism is a theory of good, not a theory of right. For utilitarians, the matter is more straightforward. Ethics is about people, and the only things that are good are those things that are good for people. Now let's look at how consequentialism breaks down into different forms. The main branch is utilitarianism, the idea that whatever is good must be good for people. Classic utilitarianism, described by Bentham and Mill, depends on calculus of collective net utility. In classic utilitarianism and all of its variants, the concept of utility is couched in terms of an individual's subjective evaluation of pleasure, happiness, pain, misery, preferences, motives, or dispositions. In other words, classic utilitarianism is dependent on the individual moral agent's personal and subjective evaluation of the particular conception of utility involved. What does that tell us about utilitarian calculus? It is almost always subjective and personal. There are three basic forms of consequentialist or utilitarian ethics which have evolved from classic utilitarianism, and within each can be found different nuanced forms of utilitarian frameworks. Hedonistic utilitarianism assumes that rightness of an action depends entirely on the amount of pleasure it tends to produce and the amount of pain it tends to prevent. Hedonism then further claims that pleasure is the only intrinsic good and that pain is the only intrinsic bad. Many view hedonistic utilitarianism or hedonism as being selfish, but it is worth remembering that this is a valid form of consequentialist ethics and one often overlooked by students in this course. Preference utilitarianism, also known as preferentialism, is a form of utilitarianism in contemporary philosophy. It is distinct from original utilitarianism in that it values actions that fulfill the greatest amount of personal interests rather than actions that generate the greatest amount of pleasure. Hence, what is good is desire satisfaction or fulfillment of preferences, not necessarily just pleasure or the avoidance of pain. Welfare utilitarianism, on the other hand, bases its calculus on the notion of collective net welfare, where this concept is framed in terms of something more objectively measurable than subjective personal evaluations. The most common variant defines welfare in standard economic terms. Hence, economic welfare utilitarianism argues that the alternative that provides the greatest good for the greatest number comes down to the one that maximizes net economic welfare for the greatest number. So both hedonistic and preference utilitarianism are based on the moral agent's subjective experience. In contrast, welfare utilitarianism is based on objectively defined life interests such as monetary wealth, access to healthcare or education, etc. We can also examine the differences in these more subjective pleasures and preferences from idealist or egalitarian points of view. In egalitarian preference or hedonistic utilitarianism, all preferences and pleasures are equally worthy and have equal value. Idealist forms of hedonistic or preference utilitarianism allow us to acknowledge that some preferences or pleasures, so-called ideal preferences or pleasures, have more value than others. These can be described as higher or lower pleasures. Higher pleasures tend to be more intellectual, more emotional, satisfying in a non-physical way, and lower ones are far more physical. It takes a lot more to make me happy than it does to make my dog happy. My dog is happy eating the same food every single day, which will become tedious for me and eventually lead to unhappiness. So lower pleasures tend to be physical, easily satisfied, and of less value. Higher pleasures tend to be more intellectual or emotional, more challenging to satisfy, and are therefore valued more. So, as we consider the question from the previous slide, what defines a right act, we find that various forms of consequentialism will answer that question in different ways. Classic consequentialism, whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences as opposed to the circumstances or the intrinsic nature of the act or anything that happened before the act. Actual consequentialism, whether an act is morally right depends only on the actual consequences as opposed to foreseen, foreseeable, intended, or likely consequences. Direct consequentialism, whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences of the act itself, as opposed to the consequences of the agent's motive, or a rule or practice that covers other acts of the same kind, and so on. Evaluative consequentialism, moral rightness depends only on the value of the consequences, as opposed to non-evaluative features of the consequences. Hedonism, the value of consequences depends only on the pleasures and pains in the consequences as opposed to other supposed goods such as freedom, knowledge, life, and so on. Maximizing consequentialism. Moral rightness depends only on which consequences are best as opposed to merely satisfactory or an improvement over the status quo. Aggregative consequentialism. Which consequences are best is some function of the values of parts of those consequences, as opposed to rankings of whole worlds or sets of consequences. Total consequentialism. Moral rightness depends only on the total net good in the consequences, as opposed to the average net good per person. Universal consequentialism. Moral rightness depends on the consequences for all people or sentient beings, as opposed to only the individual agent, members of the individual society, present people, or any other limited group. And there are many other forms. The point here is not to get you to memorize dozens of different forms of consequentialist ethics, but to recognize that there are many different flavors of consequentialism, and which form of consequentialism you choose can have a profound impact on the morality of the action. There are also a couple other factors to consider. Equal consideration. In determining moral rightness, benefits to one person matter just as much as similar benefits to any other person. In other words, all who count equally. Agent neutrality. Whether some consequences are better than others does not depend on whether the consequences are evaluated from the perspective of the agent as opposed to an impartial observer. Now that we have established what consequentialism is and what it depends on, we need to recognize that there are actual different ways to apply consequentialist thinking. The most important distinction is between act and rule consequentialism. Now that we understand the basic definition of consequentialism, we need to recognize an important distinction within consequentialist ethics, the difference between act consequentialism and rule consequentialism. This distinction addresses a fundamental question. Do we evaluate each action individually, or do we follow general rules that tend to produce good consequences? Act consequentialism says that we should evaluate each individual action by its specific consequences. When you're faced with a decision, you analyze that particular situation. Will this specific action in these exact circumstances produce better overall outcomes than any alternative action available to me? For example, If someone asks whether they should lie to protect someone's feeling, an act consequentialist would say, analyze this specific situation. Consider who's involved, what the consequences of lying versus telling the truth would be in this case, and what's at stake. Will this particular lie produce better overall outcomes than telling the truth right now? Rule consequentialism takes a different approach. Instead of evaluating each action individually, we should follow rules that generally produce the best consequences when followed consistently. Using the same example, a rule consequentialist would say, follow the rule honesty is the best policy, because that rule, when generally followed by people in society, produces better outcomes over time than a rule that permits lying. We don't evaluate each individual case. We follow the rule that has the best overall consequences. The key difference is that act consequentialism is case-by-case decision-making, while rule consequentialism provides stable guidelines that we apply consistently. Why does this matter in cybersecurity? Consider the controversial topic of hacking back, when a victim of a cyber attack launches a counterattack against their attacker. An act consequentialism might justify hacking back in a specific case. This particular actor is threatening critical infrastructure, conventional law enforcement has proven inadequate, and we can neutralize the threat with minimal collateral damage. In this specific situation, hacking back produces better consequences. A rule consequentialist would ask a different question. If hacking back becomes an accepted practice, if we establish a rule that victims can hack their attackers, what are the overall consequences of that rule? They might conclude that such a rule would lead to escalation, mistaken attribution, international conflict, and damage to innocent third parties, and therefore the rule itself produces bad consequences, even if some individual cases might work out well. Whether you're an act or rule consequentialist, you still face a fundamental challenge. How do you actually measure the consequences you're trying to maximize? We've discussed what consequentialism is and how it can be applied, but now we need to confront what many philosophers consider its most serious practical challenge, the measurement and calculation problem. The issue is straightforward but deeply challenging. How do we actually measure and compare happiness, utility, or welfare across different people and situations? Remember, consequentialism requires us to maximize the good, but to maximize something, we need to measure it, and that's where things get really complicated. Let me walk you through three fundamental measurement challenges. First, interpersonal comparison. Is your happiness from receiving $100 equal to mine? This might seem like a simple question, but it's actually quite profound. Different people value things differently. A $100 gift might bring tremendous happiness to someone who is struggling financially, but barely registers for a wealthy person. Someone who loves books might get immense pleasure from a book that someone else wouldn't care about at all. So how do we add up utility across different people? If a policy makes Alice slightly happier and Bob significantly less happy, how do we accurately calculate the net effect? We can't literally get inside people's heads and measure their happiness on the same scale. Second, incommensurability. This is the problem of comparing fundamentally different kinds of goods. How do we compare privacy against security, freedom against safety, lives saved against quality of life, preserved for future generations? These aren't just different amounts of the same thing. They're qualitatively different values. You can't reduce them to a single unit of measurement. It's not like comparing 5 apples to 3 apples. It's like trying to add apples and orchestras. The categories don't match up. Third, infinite effects. Actions have ripple effects that extend far into the future. When we make a decision today, it has consequences for tomorrow, next week, next year, or the next decade. These consequences themselves have consequences. Where do we draw the line? If I plant a tree today, it might provide shade for someone in 50 years who then sits under it and has a conversation that changes their life, which affects their children's lives, and so on. How do we possibly account for all of these downstream consequences? And if we can't account for them all, how do we know we're actually maximizing the good? Given these measurement challenges, it's not surprising that consequentialists have proposed different ways of defining and measuring the good. Let's look at three main approaches: hedonistic, preference, and welfare utilitarianism. Let's dive deeper into how we define good. Hedonists define goods in terms of pleasure and pain. Pleasure in the absence of pain are good, pain in the absence of pleasure are bad. This focuses on short-term pleasure maximization. What feels good right now? Preference utilitarians define good in terms of desire and preferences. The satisfaction of desires and fulfillment of preferences is good. Frustration of desires or preferences is bad. This tends towards long-term maximization of preferences. What will satisfy me over time? The key difference is time horizon and whether we focus on immediate sensation or long-term satisfaction. Welfare utilitarians take yet another approach. They define good in terms of objective welfare interests like life expectancy, access to education, employment, health, or housing. This approach has some advantages. It resolves the difficulty in measuring subjective pleasure or pain among individuals that both hedonists and preference utilitarians face. These objective welfare interests are easy to quantify empirically. We can measure life expectancy, count educational opportunities, and assess healthcare access. However, there's no guarantee of egalitarian distribution of these welfare interests, which can be problematic from an ethical standpoint. Let's say I have a class of 10 students and I want to make the class $1,000 richer. So I give everyone in the class $100. This class is now $1,000 richer. Alternatively, I could give one student $991 and give each of the other students $1. The result is the same from a welfare utilitarian perspective. I have enriched the class by $1,000. One student simply benefited more than the other 9. Here's where consequentialism gets even more complicated. Do we judge actions based on their actual consequences or their expected consequences? Consequentialist moral theories that focus on actual or objectively probable consequences are often described as objective consequentialism. In contrast, consequentialist moral theories that focus on intended or foreseen consequences are usually described as subjective consequentialism. These theories that concentrate on reasonable, foreseeable consequences are then not subjective insofar as they do not depend on anything inside the actual subject's mind. Still, they are subjective in that they do rely on which consequences this particular subject would foresee if he or she were better informed or more rational. Suppose that Alice finds a runaway teenager, Jane, who asks for money to get home. Alice wants to help and reasonably believes that buying a bus ticket home for this runaway will help. So she buys a bus ticket and puts the runaway on the bus. Unfortunately, the bus is involved in a freak accident and the runaway is killed. If actual consequences are what determine moral rightness, then it was morally wrong for Alice to buy the bus ticket for this runaway. Objective utilitarians would say that Alice's act was morally wrong. Subjective utilitarians might agree that the act was morally wrong, but they would say it was blameless wrongdoing because her motives were good and she was not responsible, given that she could not have foreseen that her act would cause harm. This brings into play another concept, proximate consequentialism. Did the act lead directly to the result? Was it proximate to the outcome? While Alice's act did place Jane on the bus, she did not directly contribute to the accident that caused the crash, resulting in Jane's death. Therefore, one could argue that Alice was not the proximate cause of the teen's death. Now, let's consider the strengths of consequentialist thinking. First, consequentialism represents a natural common sense approach to making ethical decisions. When most people think about whether something is right or wrong, they naturally consider what will happen if I do this. Second, it's flexible and pragmatic because it is based on consequences of actions rather than the actions themselves. There are no absolute rules that can never be broken. Context matters. Third, it requires no special wisdom or education to put into practice. You don't need to be a theologian or a philosopher to think about consequences. Finally, it focuses on increasing pleasure and decreasing pain, which directly impact the human condition. These are things everyone can understand and relate to. But consequentialism also faces serious criticisms. First, it relies on being able to accurately predict the future, the consequences of an action, which is impossible to do consistently. We don't always know what the end results of our actions will be. Second, it can be viewed as inherently selfish in its pursuit of pleasure. If maximizing pleasure is the goal, couldn't that lead to hedonistic selfishness? Third, and perhaps most troubling, it can be used to justify truly heinous acts in pursuit of the greater good. If the ends justify the means, couldn't torture and killing be justified if it saves more lives? Finally, it can be construed as overly demanding if followed consistently. Do you really have to always do whatever produces the most good for the most people? What about your own projects? What about your own relationships? Among computer ethicists, James Moore, one of the original framers of the ACM Code of Ethics, strongly promotes just consequentialism. He argues that only a universal set of computer ethics is useful and cautions against framing a culturally specific or relative set of ethics. Instead, he feels that we can identify core ideas in computer ethics on which to frame a universal ethical theory. Moore introduces the acronym ASK for. He states that no matter what goals humans seek, they need ability, security, knowledge, freedom, opportunity, and resources in order to accomplish their projects. These are the goods that permit each of us to do whatever we want to. He suggests that decision makers should embrace policies that allow individuals to obtain these goods and to avoid the bads, death, pain, disability, etc. He also cautions against choosing a policy which appears to provide maximum good in the short run, but which may create unpleasant consequences in the long run. In their 2016 work, Tuffley and Antonio grapple with the question of how we define the good regarding information technology. They conclude that, in the broadest sense, technology is ethical when it is life-affirming, when it helps people grow towards their full potential, and when it allows them to accomplish what they might not otherwise be able to. Here the claim is that technology's goal is to produce human flourishing, and that is the standard by which it ought to be measured. Using this yardstick, a computer engineer can ask, what is the likelihood that more or greater human flourishing would be produced through choosing this action over another? Here, intent or psychological attitude does not matter, and the outcome is primary as prescribed by the utilitarian ethics approach. In cybersecurity, we constantly make consequentialist calculations. Is this security measure worth the loss of privacy? Will this vulnerability disclosure do more good than harm? Should we hack back against attackers if it might protect more people? Let me summarize a few key points of this presentation. Consequentialist theories judge the morality of an action solely by its consequences, not intentions, not duties, just outcomes. These theories originated in the utilitarian philosophies of Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Henry Sedgwick in the 18th and 19th centuries. Consequentialism can be complicated by contradictory opinions of what is good, the question of actual versus intended consequences, and determining who benefits from an action and by how much. Despite these complexities, consequentialism remains one of the most influential and intuitively appealing ethical frameworks, particularly in fields like technology and cybersecurity, where we must constantly weigh costs and benefits. Let me leave you with this powerful quote from John Stuart Mill. Bad men need nothing more to compass their ends than that good men should look on and do nothing. This reminds us that consequentialism isn't just about calculating outcomes, it's a call to action. If we care about consequences, we must act to create better ones. In cybersecurity, this means we can't just stand by when we see systems that could harm people or leave them vulnerable. Ethics requires engagement, not just contemplation. If you have questions about this presentation or other aspects of the course, please feel free to email me or post a question in the Ask Your Instructor discussion forum in Canvas. I tend to respond to email much faster than to forum posts, but if you believe your question may be of interest to other students, then the Ask Your Instructor forum may be the more appropriate venue for your question. This has been Consequentialism, MPCR 5000, written and presented by Professor Scott D. Applegate, Georgetown University.